Good afternoon from Tokyo. ADBI warmly welcome you all in this featured speaker webinar. Today, our featured speaker is Professor Rohini Pande, who will discuss the interlinkage between poverty, inequality, and power, and the role of policy in driving inclusive growth. She will examine how poverty and growth trends have changed over time, and the keys to development research moving forward. Professor Pande will also draw upon her research on gender and labor market responses to the COVID-19 crisis to assess how institutions can better support women's socioeconomic empowerment and social protection reforms, and chart pathways to equitable post-pandemic recovery and development. Professor Pande is Henry John Hines II Professor of Economics and Director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale University. Her research interests include formal and informal institutions' function in shaping political and economic power dynamics, social protection innovation, and the role of greater awareness of economic justice and human rights in driving change. I'm also delighted to let you know that she joins the ADBI book series on Asian and Pacific Sustainable Development as a co-editor, and share her insights for improving quality and value of our publication. Previously, Professor Pande was Rafiq Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School, where she co-founded Evidence for Policy Design. She received her PhD in economics from the London School of Economics and an MA from Oxford University. Please welcome Professor Pande. Rohini, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very generous and warm welcome. And I think thank you for everyone for joining. I realize in different parts of the world, it's very different times. So let me jump straight into my presentation, and that hopefully will also mean we have enough time to have open discussion at the end. Just to make sure everyone can see my screen. Great. So what I wanted to talk about today was really trying to discuss a bit the features that we see of growth and development over the last few decades, and try to use that to think about what the future of development policy may look like, recognizing the fact that I think most developing countries and policymakers still place a lot of importance on economic growth as an important pathway out of development. So what I want to start by doing is first just describing to you kind of what we see as the trends. Where are the poor concentrated in the world today? After this, I want to talk about one way that we may think about lowering poverty is recognizing that growth in itself will not reach anyone. A first question is, how far can we get by just a more efficient fiscal redistribution? So as we move towards, say, digital transfers and different ways of reducing corruption, is that going to be enough to lower poverty? I'm actually going to argue that's not, that what more efficient redistribution doesn't do is ensure that redistribution is inclusive of all groups. And to make this point, I'm going to actually focus the rest of the talk on a specific social group of women and describe how issues of social identity and power interact in enabling women's access to, I think, in the end, what is the main way people are able to move out of poverty is by accessing labor markets and earning opportunities. So let me start with just describing to you a little bit of how I see the landscape of development having changed. So to remind you, the period since the early 1980s, I think has really been at many levels an important success story for development. So this graph shows you the decline you see in poverty across the world since 1981. In 1981, roughly 40% of the world's population lived under $1.90 a day. And by 2020, this was at around 10%. And this very significant decline, to a large extent, was driven by the tremendous growth we saw in East Asian countries. Of course, an important caveat on the story is what COVID has done. So you can see in the graph at the end, the dotted lines are the pre-COVID projections of how poverty would fall. And then the continued dark lines reflect the anticipated changes due to COVID. And we know that one of the first effects of COVID has been that for the first time in the 21st century, we have seen a rise in poverty across the world. Now, a second feature that goes along with this decline in poverty across the world is a changing trend in income inequality. Obviously, as the world's poorer countries have grown richer, as China has become richer, as East Asian countries have become richer, as South Asia begins to grow, we see a reduction in cross-country inequality. However, at the same time, and I think this is going to be a focus of a lot of my discussion, what we are seeing is increasing within country inequality. I think historically we would have thought of Latin America as the continent of unequal countries, but Asia is now beginning to catch up quite fast, especially through the pandemic as well, in rising within country inequality. And what these two factors together mean that economic growth in a low-income country is increasingly not reaching everyone. And so when we look at where the world's poor live, the striking feature we see are two. Earlier on, you could quite easily have this discussion of either poor people or poor countries interchangeably. But now what we see is that the majority of the world's poor live in what I would describe as high poverty, middle income countries. So these are large populous countries that have seen significant growth over the last few decades. So they've moved from low income to middle income status. But at the same time, they are unequal. And so India and Nigeria are classic examples of this. We, of course, continue to see many poor people in African countries, but even here, it's countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania, which have seen significant growth, that continue to have a lot of the world's poor. And so if we take sort of this definition of a country as being a high poverty country, if it has more than 1% of the extreme poor, and we say they're middle income, so they've transitioned out of aid eligible categories, then what you see that there are roughly 5 countries, India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Kenya, that are responsible for roughly half of the world's poor. And so, of course, while it remains important to kickstart growth in the poorest parts of the world, to think about how do we get growth started in countries like, say, DRC or Central African Republic, we also need to think about, if we want to reach the world's poor, how should we be designing policy in these HIPMEs? And that really is a lot of the focus of today's discussion. And just to make this point that when we think about defining policies, we really need to think about inequality within countries. I want to give you this example. So on the left-hand side, I give you the example of 2 countries in Africa, which are low-income countries, the DRC and Ethiopia. DRC has got 92 million people and $520 GDP per capita. On the right-hand side, I have 2 low-income regions of middle-income countries, so northern Nigeria and Bihar, India. I want to emphasize the case of Bihar, India. It's a very populous country. You can see out of the 4 areas presented in this slide, it actually has the most population, and it's poor. And indeed, if Bihar was a country of its own, it would be the most populous, low-income country with poor households today, and it would also count as a fragile economy. And so I think increasingly, as we think about policy, it's not sufficient for us to focus at the country level, but you need to start thinking within country. And maybe this is something we can return to in our discussion. I think this poses a set of interesting questions for development agencies that often function at the national level, not at the subnational level. So let me just summarize. As I said, if I look at the world's extreme poor, again defined using the World Bank criteria of a household with less than $1.90 a day, according to the most recent estimate, roughly 66% of them are middle-income countries. Reflecting the fact that there's a lot of within-country inequality, we see the majority of the world's poor are in rural areas, largely dependent on agriculture. Importantly, we've seen some improvements, especially in education. So 40% have completed primary schooling but are still poor. And they are large households, and so the world's poor include a disproportionate amount of children. So children in the age of 0 to 14 make up 44% of the world's poor. And I think this again emphasizes the fact that as we think about anti-poverty policies, we not only need to think within country, but we also need to think within a demographic group. So what does it mean, I think, especially from a perspective of an aid agency to look at these trends? One important part of looking at these trends is that increasingly what's going to matter is domestic growth and redistribution, not aid, simply because aid is a small part of the portfolio of middle-income countries, many of whom are also being moved out of aid eligible criteria. So certainly Pakistan and Bangladesh have a reasonable amount of aid, but if you look at several of these other countries like India or Indonesia or Philippines, aid is a very small part. So perhaps the best role that aid can play in these settings is really to make small innovations or changes that can have large multiplier effects. And an interesting question is, what would those be? Again, something we come back to in the end. And then finally, one fact I'd like to highlight is a reason why we need to think beyond growth is climate breakdowns and climate change, which are now a reality today. Importantly, some of the countries that perhaps most need an increase in economic resources are actually the ones that are going to be affected the most adversely by climate change. I think this summer has shown in South Asia how heat waves can arrive earlier and earlier. And this is from a Notre Dame exposure index that shows that across the world, Niger and India, followed by then Burma, Zambia, and Angola, are going to be the most significantly affected by climate change. So 3 out of these 5 countries are high poverty, middle income countries. And so against this background of increasing climate change, also increasing automation, which means that the traditional pathway of manufacturing leading to a large number of jobs for low-skilled individuals being less available, how should we conceive of the way forward for development policy that is both inclusive and sustainable? So the first idea I want to explore, which I think is something that has received a lot of interest, is thinking about, can we move towards more efficient fiscal redistribution? So here, for instance, one recent increase, and this has in part, I think, been very linked to the COVID pandemic, which saw huge interest in cash transfers, is, I think researchers have used a combination of experimental and non-experimental methods to really help us gain an understanding in this area. So first, there seems to be very limited evidence that providing cash to the poor leads them to have less engagement with work. So there's, I think, significant evidence that the poor use cash for important purposes, for instance, in health and education, and we don't find any evidence that discourages work. More recently, there's been a set of papers that have conducted field experiments at scale. So let me just highlight 2 examples. There's one that uses the give directly method of providing mobile payments to give $1,000 per household in Kenya. And what they found is very significant gains, not just in individuals' own lives, but if done at scale, they can help kind of structurally transform the economy. Another such policy example is the ultra-poor asset transfer policy that was begun in Bangladesh by BRAC, and we've seen it has successfully pushed many households out of poverty. However, I think in taking these important findings that help us understand what constrains the lives of the poor into policy, we have to recognize that they're often not feasible policies fiscally. So for instance, in the Eggers et al., the annualized cash transfers that they were making was something like 15% of the GDP in the treatment villages. And even in the Balboni et al. Paper, what they find that the transfer size, which was very significant, $490 per household, was still too small for the poorest households. And so what that means is that, we cannot rely on just saying, let's just expand cash transfers, both because these lower middle income countries do not have the fiscal bandwidth to make transfers the size that's needed. And especially the transfers that they can make, even if they have impacts, are unlikely to be large enough for the poorest households. And just to emphasize this point, let me remind you what the size of the government looks like for these middle income countries. So this is a classic measure of government expenditure. And I think this first line is well known, that if you look at high income countries, basically since the 1960s, government spending as a share of total GDP has increased and then leveled off at roughly 20%. If you look at low-income countries, it sees a similar pattern, except that it's leveled off at around 15% or slightly under 15%. And then this shows you other middle-income countries, so richer middle-income countries, they actually are now increasingly looking like high-income countries. So we might say that's sort of where you're aiming. However, what's striking is when you look at these high-poverty middle-income countries, which are countries that have significant inequality within them, they've seen growth, but disequalizing growth very often. Their share of expenditure lies even below that of low-income countries. And if that surprises you, I would say the main difference, and we've checked this in the data, is really coming from the disappearing of aid for these countries. So these countries are getting rich, aid is leaving these countries, but they're not able to move into having the state capacity to raise taxes sufficiently to make up for it. So in net, the fiscal redistribution towards the poor in these countries is falling, which can be quite concerning. So for instance, in India, if you look at health expenditures as a share of GDP, it's incredibly low. And so you'll have many of these sectors which are important for the poor that are doing worse after these countries have become richer. So what are the two solutions you could have here? We could look at this data and say where we need to go is sort of technocratic. We have to recognize that we have less money. So let's try to really prevent leakages, reduce corruption. The second, which I think is harder, is to start to try to think about how do we get the political will to expand these programs. So if you think about transfer programs and we ask, how do we actually reduce corruption? I think, again, this has been an area like cash transfers that has seen a lot of important research insights. The recognition starts from the point that most transfer programs occur within a delegated governance system, and they may be misaligned incentives. So the bureaucrat at the top may well want to deliver public services, but the frontline school teacher in the village finds it too costly to go to school every day, or wants to take bribes, and that leads to weak service delivery. One of the areas that people have focused a lot on trying to understand how to improve this is in the area of cash transfers, where if you move to digital payments, you can reduce many of the points at which leakage could occur. You can reduce the set of bureaucrats involved, and you can have much better digital trails to identify where corruption might be occurring. And in work I've done, we have looked at this in the context of India and shown that it's indeed true. If you move to government to person digital payments, you can significantly reduce corruption. However, what we found is reducing corruption doesn't necessarily mean that the pie expands for the poor. Rather, what often happens is if you can provide the same amount of transfers for less resources because corruption has gone down, the governments may use that as a way of managing their fiscal deficits rather than expanding the pie. And very often these kind of technocratic solutions occur within the bureaucracy, which means that citizens aren't even aware that there is potentially more resources that they could push to acquire. So I think these technocratic innovations are important. Obviously, anything that helps us have more efficient transfer resources is important, but it does not in itself necessarily point towards more equitable distribution. And that really brings me, I think, to the last part of the issues I want to discuss is how do we move to have more equitable distribution of resources. I think economists have spent a lot of time thinking about efficiency, just most technical efficiency and also allocative efficiency. Both are extremely important, but neither of them will ensure inclusive or sustainable growth. And I think in order to move towards that, we really need to understand who has access to the state, especially in democracies, who is able to push to have fairer redistribution of resources. Now, across the world, as I said, there are many different markers of social identity that correlate with economic well-being. I'm going to focus today on gender, but you can think of many of the lessons also reflecting, for instance, how we think about ethnic identity. And one important reason why we see identity be a marker is that, across a number of labor markets, we see there are gatekeepers. They will be the people who will decide who gets the jobs, who run the interviews. And these are often people from majority social groups who then use their institutional advantages to limit rent sharing. So looking at women, I just want to remind you of some facts of why this is relevant. So if you look across the extreme poor, the most striking fact is that, the extreme poor, if anyone, are the ones who would benefit a lot from even earning basic wage labor. But if you compare across men and women, only 10% of men among the extreme poor are out of the labor force, while half the women are out of the labor force. And among the women who work, we again see more a tendency to have unpaid work or be self-employed. So I think this is really a big question to think about. Why is it that among the poor, we're seeing such low rates of work for women? And again, to remind you, this is not to take away from the extreme importance of the unpaid work that women do. But these are poor households who would both directly benefit from payment for work. And the care economy is important, but it's perhaps not going to get payments anytime soon. But also importantly, when we just look at decision making or measures of female agency, it is the case that women who, at every level, who have some kind of work status, report having more agency within the household. So I think here, the thesis that I would put forward, and I'm not going to have time to fully get into it, is that informal institutions, and in particular gender norms, end up playing an important role. These are norms around, male breadwinner versus the woman who takes care. This both provides sort of prescriptive norms about what's appropriate behavior, and then it has often been accompanied by legal structures that make it harder for women to enter the labor force. So for instance, if you look here, this is a graph that has labor law equality from the World Bank legal index on the x-axis against data from the World Values Survey to see what the support for gender inequality in jobs is. So I think what's unsurprising is you can see Sweden is at the top. It has perfect labor law equality. Even then, I think you notice that 20% of the Swedish population are not supportive of gender equality in jobs. And then at the other end, you see countries which have very low labor equality, say in the Middle East, but reasonable support for gender equality. But I'd say a lot of the countries that we're thinking about as the HIPME countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, have relatively low labor equality. And that is arguably a reasonable constraint on where they are able to go in terms of providing poor women jobs that they can access. So just to summarize, I think, in today's world, which despite the pandemic, despite perhaps the oncoming recession and inflation, is actually a rich world compared to where we were in 1980. I think when we think about escaping poverty, I think it's incorrect to think of this just in terms of how do we get the poor $1.90 a day. I think it becomes increasingly important to recognize that growth processes in itself are never enough. We need systems to redistribute resources to ensure human capital investments by the world poor. And this requires us to have institutions that are inclusive. And to get to those inclusive institutions, we often have to explicitly focus on policy design. If we don't do that, these institutions that are often controlled by the elite will not automatically reach out to the poor. And so I think if we consider elite capture of institutions to actually be a failure of institutional design, then I think the question as in policy we should be posing is how do we design these institutions to enable a more equitable distribution? I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to take the last 3 or 4 minutes to just talk very briefly about some things we have learned about gender intentional policies in the labor market. So let me focus in for just this quick example on India, where you can see that across the decades, starting from 1990, India has continually remained off, if you will, the regression trend line when it comes to female labor force participation. And indeed, after the pandemic, it has gone down even more so. It's a setting where there are quite strong gender norms. So you can see here, there's a strong belief that women should not work, especially among men, and that the men pay a social cost of women work. What we did in this setting was one, a gender intentional policy, which was to say, just very simply, let's focus on financial inclusion that goes beyond just opening bank accounts for women, but actually ensures that they get direct deposits of the work they do under the workfare program into their bank account. So our comparison is between women who have just bank accounts and those who have a guarantee that their payments will go into their own bank account. And so the D2T, which is the light blue line, is when you have direct deposits and training. And the dotted line just shows you what happens when you just have bank accounts. And what you should take away from this is that labor supply went up for those women who had guaranteed earnings in their bank account. We argue this is because they were able to use these resources to improve their bargaining power. And what's very important is that over time, 3 years later, we see a significant improvement in gender norms or beliefs about work, especially among women, a bit more noisily among men. So I think there's more work to be done there. So finally, this also plays out over time. So what this shows you is the federal workfare program that was studied in the previous slides I showed you became a very important social security net during COVID. So the dark blue line shows you actually how much demand under this program increased after 2020 relative to what we saw in 2016 to 19. Now, what we see in this graph is that actually women who had been given this direct deposit facility continue to increase their benefits from the program during the COVID period as against those who had only accounts. So again, I think once you can build policies or infrastructure that go beyond just opening accounts, but strengthens women's ability to use those accounts, then when a crisis hits, we actually see them benefiting more. In contrast, and while this is a bit of a down, I think it's an important thing to highlight, we have been, during the COVID period, we have been studying a panel of over 5,000 migrant workers who returned home during the first lockdown in India. Just to remind you, many people see this return migration from urban to rural India during the first lockdown as the largest internal migration in India since partition. 1 year later, what we see, a very large share of them have still not migrated. But what's important is that women are much more likely to say that they're not thinking of migrating because of domestic duties. And why does this matter? This matters hugely because I think being able to migrate from rural to urban areas is one of the most important ways of raising incomes. So if you look at the income recovery, those who've remigrated have made up a much larger share of their income recovery. So if you look at married women, if you've remigrated, you're at 60% of pre-pandemic income, while if you have not remigrated, you're 9%. So the fact that these women who moved back during lockdown were less likely to move out, a lot, they say, because of domestic duties, means that gender gaps that are supported by traditional norms may be re-emerging over this period. So I've gone through a lot, but I hope this gives us many issues to discuss. And I just end by saying that I think institutions really are vital to provide the poor with the resources to escape poverty and the power to demand state resources. I think very often as development economists, we sort of focus on economic growth in the vacuum. But unless we think about these supporting institutions I think there's a real danger that we end up creating very unequal economies. And then I think, as we are seeing in many parts of the world, I think that becomes a ripe source also for conflict. From the perspective of research, I think in a world like the one we're living in today, I think we face a tension, especially as economists, between often offering what appear to be technocratic solutions, kind of thinking about ways of increasing efficiency, versus solutions that we are often more hesitant to talk about because it requires you to take a normative stance, one that transfers resources and power. But I think in the end, it's important for us to recognize that as development economists, we do have a normative stance. When we say we want to do things like end poverty, that is a normative stance. That's not an efficiency stance. And if we are going to remain true to that goal, then I think it's important that we need to engage with these questions of how to change power structure. And I think there's no time more important than now as the world is emerging out of the pandemic. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pande, for your wonderful presentations. I think you have really touched very important issues that we are facing today, and it's we are honored to have you and to listen to your wonderful insight, Professor Pande. I would like to, based on what you have said now, particularly on power, trust, elite capture, institutions, and inclusions. So these are, I think, very powerful words that you have put in your presentations and discussions. So taking into consideration these few words, I would like to ask your views on or what kind of policy recommendations would you promote in order to improve participations of the marginalized, of the poor in the development process when the inequality is rising, because lack of participations would also result into elite captures and institutional failure. So we'd really appreciate if you can throw your views on that.
Thank you. I hope some of this I've covered in the talk. So let me just try to summarize my kind of broad thinking here. So, I think if we are to move to think much more about inclusion or think about bringing in marginalized people, I think it's important, first of all, as a measurement tool, we don't just measure country growth. So I think, there have been some move towards by some groups, like, for instance, the World Economic Forum every year, puts out, say, the gender gap index. But I think thinking more carefully how, multilaterals or, groups like the ADBI can help us start thinking about metrics that we can support countries to take seriously on, which actually take into account these measures of inequality or social exclusion. I think is a very important first step. And actually at the Growth Center, we've been thinking about how do we have measures that, say, at a point of structural transformation, actually not just capture increases in growth, but also how that's spread. The second thing I'd say, and I think this is something we learned, is I think investments in transparency are very important. Even in a democracy, very often the reason why I think citizens don't push for redistribution or for their rights is because they don't actually know, what is feasible, what is available. And again, I think the more we can push towards increasing transparency of just what governments are doing could be an important step towards this. And I think, again, I think one theme I would like to bring out is in a lot of these countries, aid budgets are not large enough to really transform the growth process. But I think where they can be transformative is in data, in measurement, in metrics, in helping pilot ways of thinking about transparency. So I think that's partly why I focused on those as important aspects.
Thank you very much, Professor Pande, for your views on that. Yeah, we have seen, in several places where we visited, lack of participations from the poor and the marginalized group. Even within institutions, we have noticed that. So I think what you have pointed out is very important. May I invite my colleagues Daniel Suryadharman to ask a few questions to Professor Pande?
Okay, thanks, Bill. Hi, Professor Pande. Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. So I think an important part about moving forward on this topic is getting policymakers on board in trying to improve gender equality, because I think they hold a very large influence on changing norms, for example, and enacting policies. So based on your research, what are some of the ways to increase policymakers, government lawmakers' attention to gender equality in various socioeconomic outcomes? And I guess related to that, sort of related to what Dale was asking, is what research questions do you think we as researchers should tackle in these countries? Thank you very much.
Thanks. So I think, many of us think of as, gender equality or providing fair opportunities to men and women as an issue of justice. But I think actually to affect change in policy, it's equally, if not more important, to demonstrate the, if you will, the kind of business case or the economic case for it. And so I think, one goal that one can have is to actually show how, low female labor force participation or distorting choices in particular directions can actually worsen economic growth or economic outcomes. And I think one of the most powerful things to identify there is to see, this very significant rise that we've seen in women or girls in education. So I think for most part, we have managed to close a lot of educational gaps. However, in some ways, we may say that you'll be concerned about the talent allocation if women are unable to then enter and continue on in the labor market. So in most countries, what we see is sort of reductions in female labor force participation either come at the time of marriage or typically at the time of having children. Now, we can talk quite a lot about, say, maternity policies, but to the extent that these remain, which they do in many countries, sort of taxes on companies that provide it rather than being state mandated, it really doesn't incentivize companies to internalize the benefits. So I think kind of recognizing the fact that from the state perspective, the costs are really social costs, right? So these are large social costs when you have very educated women in sort of top sectors dropping out because either they don't have adequate maternity leave and childcare, or because just the organizational structures are somewhat toxic for them in different ways. I think this is something that is important for the state to recognize, the importance of it and address it, not push it back to companies, because companies will never have the personal incentives to fully resolve these issues.
Thank you, Professor Pande, for pointing this out. I think also like of late, because of work and raising children and families issues, I think we have also seen that there is a shift in the fertility age group across the world. We have noticed that also in India, where the fertility age is moving backwards. Maybe I think they are postponing the birth rate, childbirth, because they want to be in the job market. So now, may I also invite our colleagues Dina Azagalvia, she's energy economist, to ask a question.
Thank you very much, Professor Rohini. Your presentation is very touching. I also recently did research on energy poverty, not on general poverty, but energy poverty. So let me please ask you, on one hand, food prices, energy prices going up in many countries. But on another hand, many governments are asked to remove fossil fuel subsidies, right? You remember, for climate change mitigation, to limit global temperature rise. So what would you recommend to governments who are planning to remove, let's say, fossil fuel subsidies, and how to replace them in order to avoid energy poverty, especially in cold countries when actually energy is essential for life?
I think that's an important question, and I would start by saying that I think you want to separate the question of thinking about providing resources to the poor with how we tie them, right? So I don't think anyone would disagree that the poor should, spend the resources they need to get water, to have energy in rich and poor hot and cold countries. In cold countries, they say you need energy to survive the winter. In hot countries, you need energy to cool your houses in the summer. But I mean, a very simple economics 101 is that the best way you can do that is to provide untied funds rather than tied funds. So, as you're moving more towards a digital economy, as you're moving towards a greater ability to provide the poor cash transfers, there is less need to tie it through fossil fuel subsidies. You can actually provide the same set of resources independently. My colleague at the Growth Center, Nick Ryan, is doing, I think, a lot of very interesting work. For instance, asking in the state of Punjab in India, which is a very water scarce state, what happens if you, rather than subsidizing electricity to farmers, which tends to lead to excessive use of groundwater, you basically say that we'll keep that policy, but if you reduce the amount you use of electricity, we'll actually just give you a cash transfer. So that's just providing the poor with more flexible options of saying, you can use it or you can move away. And I think that's the reason why I think that's a good policy, is that we've seen that if you just try to remove fossil fuels, you tend to have a lot of political unrest. And so I think something where you give people options of saying, okay, we'll keep this policy in place, but maybe you can make even more money or get more money if you start thinking yourself of ways to move away from it, could be a way of going forward there. I think the other thing I would say is that I think thinking about how to use communities is important here, right? I mean, so to the extent that a lot of reasons we care about this is externalities, ways you can get a community to internalize these issues is going to be important. So for instance, I've been doing work on thinking about how can you use payment for ecosystem schemes, for instance, to reduce agricultural crop residue burning. And again, I think those are things that would work if you can have communities take those up.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pande. Now, may I invite my colleague, K. Sitaram, to ask you a few questions.
Thank you, Dil. Thank you, Professor Pande. You had very powerful messages for reducing poverty and also shaping the lives of women. There's an important stakeholder in this power play who are new to the game, in my view, and you didn't touch about them, so I want to ask your views about them. The ultra high net worth individuals who are playing philanthropic activities, exactly doing the same thing to reduce poverty, to help women, to children. And many of them are actually non-resident from these developing countries we want the problem to be solved. What is their role and your views on how do they match up or compare with the role of governments? Because many of them are doing this for tax breaks and other personal interest. Thank you.
No, I think it's a great question. I think many people have been thinking about it, that if, as we return to kind of a gilded age of, world income, do we need the equivalent of the Rockefellers more in thinking about these issues? And I think that's one of the reasons I brought up the literature on cash transfers and give directly. I think these are the kind of, if you will, I think policies that are very attractive to philanthropists. You cut out the state, you cut out the middleman, you use technology, and you directly reach the poor person. I think what the point I was trying to make is that this is very unlikely to be sustainable at scale. No single philanthropist, I think, can match the budget of a large country. And also, I think it's a little, there's only that far you can go without engaging in politics. So I guess I'm a believer in states and the role of kind of bilateral, multilateral institutions that engage with states on this. And so I think, there's a combination of both. At some level, we need to think about just how we're thinking about capital taxation, how we're thinking about redistribution. And I think arguing that in the end is a better way forward. But to do that, I think to convince these groups that engaging with the states is what's important, you need to show them the scale of what's feasible. I mean, I think you certainly see that transition for some of the large philanthropists. So I think a group like the Gates Foundation are increasingly engaged with states and countries when they're thinking about health system reform, because I think they've realized there's only that far you can go by having this sort of vertical down thing. So I think it has to be a continuous discussion, but I would also urge, I feel, multilateral organizations to invest more in sort of making the case for why one wants to go to the state. I would say there are a lot of groups that will make the case for just direct enterprise. I mean, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are very attracted to what they think of as a Silicon Valley solution to poverty, technology and transfers. And I think we need groups like the ADBI to kind of continually making the case for why the state needs to be engaged if you're going to have sustainable reductions in poverty.
Thanks. Thanks, Professor Pande. Linda, may I ask you to come on the floor and ask question to Professor Pande?
Sure, Jill, many thanks. Professor Pande, thank you for the focus of your talk. And I'd like to make a link to a recent event that ADBI undertook, which is focused on promoting equitable opportunities for women in agriculture. You've done a lot of your research in South Asia, and FAO estimates that approximately 60% of the population in South Asia is engaged in agriculture. You've also indicated in your talk that 64.6% of the world's poor are involved in agriculture. We don't have the percentage of women in that group, but we hear that increasingly there are more women involved in agriculture, and that they provide a higher proportion of agricultural labor because men are moving to cities in search of higher paying jobs. So in this respect, what would you say are the factors that might support or inhibit their ability to, women's ability left on these farms to make strategic choices that could benefit their livelihoods and eventually lift them out of poverty?
Thanks. I think that's a great question. And I completely agree that we are seeing an increasing feminization of agriculture. And I think with climate change, this will become more important. So let me first say one thing that I think doesn't have to do with agriculture, which is the question of why is it that men, not women, are migrating? Across the world, and I think that's some of the evidence I showed you as well, is as the non-agricultural sector becomes more important for GDP, we would hope to see labor moving out of GDP. And one of the main ways they move out is by migrating to peri-urban and urban areas where those jobs are. We're not seeing that for women. I think a lot of those constraints are structural constraints that we need to work on. How do we improve mobility? How do we improve safety considerations? How do we enable women who move with children to have access to, say, schooling for their children? So I think one part of what we need to work on is just improving migration opportunities for young women and other women. I mean, I think the Chinese case is a very good example that if you looked at the census data around 2000, one of the largest migrant groups was young women between 15 to 19 going to the coastal areas to work in garment industries. So I think one thing we need to do is enable women to leave agriculture the same way as men are leaving agriculture, because we certainly, I think what we're seeing today is too many people earning a living in agriculture versus non-agricultural opportunities. So I think that's one part. The second, I agree. I mean, to the extent that women are going to stay in agriculture, I think one of the things we need to do is a lot of the support systems for agriculture that governments have developed have historically been male focused. I think a classic one is agricultural extension workers. How agricultural extension workers work, I think their notion is that they engage with men. Thinking about everything from how the extent to which you want to have more female agricultural extension workers and how you actually change those activities, I think would be ones that, again, I think, for multilaterals and others to really ask these questions of how do we change the nature of these support services that the state is providing as the basis of who is there is changing, I think is going to be important.
That's great. Thanks very much, Professor Pande.
Thank you, Professor Pande. Thank you, Linda. May I invite Peter Morgan to ask his question?
Thanks very much for a very insightful presentation. You mentioned about the impacts of digital fiscal transfers. More generally, financial technology has gotten a lot of attention recently as a potential vehicle for financial inclusion. How has the availability of digital technology, or the lack thereof, affected income inequality and gender inequality?
Thanks. I mean, so let me start by saying I am a huge proponent of I think, digital financial inclusion efforts. I think especially in rural areas, one of the countries I work in is Nepal. I think in a country like Nepal, given the kind of remoteness, I think thus the more we have of digital financial inclusion, that is going to, has the potential to hugely transform lives. But where I think right now we are falling short is, I think we're measuring, expansion of these technologies by things like accounts opened digitally or by mobile phone expansion, not acknowledging the groups that are not able to get access to it. So one area that I'm currently working on is sort of mobile phone use among women in South Asia. So India is a striking example here because it has some of the highest rates of mobile phone coverage of, say, Facebook usage, and other digital things, but the gender gaps are very large. And these are actually very often supported with a lot of kind of normative constraints, sort of saying that unsupervised use of a phone by a woman is not appropriate. So I think we have to recognize that the moment you bring in this kind of new technology, it's not going to by itself change normative constraints faced by excluded groups. And so you're going to have to actively, for instance, try to figure out how do you create use cases that are going to change existing norms around the use. I think the same thing with kind of financial inclusion policies. You can open bank accounts, but if women, when they go to bank kiosks, are faced by just groups of men and long queues of men, they're just not going to find them as environments that they are very keen to be in. So I think for financial inclusion to succeed, especially when it comes to marginalized groups, you have to figure out how to make it work for them. And I think there's been less attention on that user case right now.
Okay, thanks very much.
May I invite Dean to ask his question?
Yeah, thank you, Rohini. Yeah, so it's a really exciting presentation, and I think the ADBI has received lots of valuable suggestions about our activities already, but I'd like to reiterate because this year marks ADBI's 25th anniversary. So I'd appreciate it greatly if you could kindly share your thoughts on ADBI's next step.
Well, let me start by congratulating ADBI and its leadership for an exciting first 25 years. I think ADBI has really established itself as a thought leader in thinking about development policy, especially kind of in the Asian and Pacific region. So certainly I hope for more of the same. I mean, I think really, having strong thought leaders that are able to speak to the collaborating aid agencies or country governments is really what we need. I feel like that has come up in different ways, that we see more money in the world, we see more money in the development sector, very often coming from these private agencies. I think a place like ADBI is uniquely positioned to be able to talk to those players, but at the same time also talking to the states, also talking to kind of more traditional ADBI. And so I think creating in part conduits for researchers, for policy practitioners to have these conversations, I think to push on what we see as the constraints would be a great role. So I think a convening role, a thought leader role, and to the extent you're investing in sort of data systems and thinking about how can one most convincingly use data and research to push the development agenda would be, I feel like ADBI is doing quite a lot of that already. So I look forward to seeing more of that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pande. Now, may I give back the floor to Karaway-san?
Thank you so much, Professor Pande, and thank you very much for all ADBI panelists. And now we have very short time for open floor question and answer. So please take me a liberty to kind of summarize all our questions into really, maybe let me first focus on many people are asking about your take, Professor Pande, for the role of education. If you could give us sort of quick answer on that.
I think, education and health, I would say both of them are just important building blocks. The reason I talk less about education is that I think we've made huge advances there. I think where we are struggling is to translate those educational gains into labor market gains, especially in the case of women, but perhaps also other marginalized groups. So in many countries right now, as I said, what we are seeing is women, if anything, often even overtaking men when it comes to educational achievement. But then we see very significant drop off from the labor market. So I feel like, researchers early on, used to like kind of showing these Mincer wage regressions of, every additional year of education, what kind of wage returns that translates into. I think, unfortunately, in a lot of countries right now, what we are seeing is the gains in education, especially for women, are translating, if you will, into maybe marriage market returns, but not actually labor market returns. And again, I think to come back to this is not preferences. I think we have multiple surveys suggesting that women do want to work, but they may need certain types of work more than others, which has certain flexibility, but also they need to get over the constraints. So I think the kind of emphasis that we've seen, which has been very successful in raising education, I think we need to see some of that in also enabling women to enter the labor force. I think sometimes there's a little bit of hesitancy here. I think people sort of feel like, oh, we are being very paternalistic if we sort of start telling women that, we need to structure your entry into labor markets. But I actually think that there is sufficient evidence now that these are actually responding to the preferences of adolescent girls and young women, that I don't think you should be so worried about trying to just strengthen women's ability to enter the labor market. And I think that's really what we need if you're going to realize full returns to education.
Thank you so much for this great answer. And now, please allow me to invite Sawada Sensei to pose his question he already prepared in advance.
Okay.
And then
Thank
Sawada
you.
Sensei, if you could just make your question short, that
Yeah,
would
very
be
short.
great.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
you.
We are running out of time. Thank you very much, Professor Pande, for a really fascinating presentation. I really learned a lot. My question is about the role of physical infrastructure. As you know, ADB has a big portfolio on physical infrastructure, safe water availability, clean and green energy, and also accessible transport. And as you said, education, the health, school buildings and health facilities are really foundation for good service delivery and precondition. But infrastructure investment decisions, where and what type and to whom, power matters. And also pre-existing physical infrastructure can be a source of power. So I can see mutually reinforcing mechanism of power and physical infrastructure. So although this criticality of physical infrastructure, there's a lot of issues, and I think as you said, right incentives and proper mechanisms to deliver services to the poor and to be inclusive is critical. So my question is very broad and open question. In the discussion you shared with us today, and in your framework, how would you place role of physical infrastructure, and how we need to proceed to set the right incentives and right mechanism design of infrastructure?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. And I actually think that requires, I think, almost its own time to discuss, because I really think we need to rethink infrastructure, how we design it, and what it's aiming to get. And I think this is very linked to climate change and to, I think, the changing nature of manufacturing and automation. So for instance, one classic thought about infrastructure has historically been that we need roads and a lot of investments in roads. But I think there's a difference between, do we need basic functioning roads? Do we need six-way highways? And in particular, what kind of roads do we need within cities? One of the things to keep in mind, especially in Africa, urbanization is growing at an incredibly high rate. And so, I think, within those urban cities, I think there's been interest, for instance, looking at BRT systems. Should we be investing in BRT systems or others? And some of this, I think, is again that understanding housing arrangements. Where are the poor living? Who would benefit from BRT? How do you deal with the politics? I spent quite a lot of time in Delhi, and certainly one thing I saw there is the BRT being dismantled because the middle class with the cars felt it was slowing them down, and the poor in buses didn't have enough voice. And so I think those are incredibly important questions. And I think we really need to rethink kind of away from traditional models of infrastructure where we're thinking of railways and things like that. Ask what is urbanization going to mean for infrastructure? What is climate change going to mean for infrastructure?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then for information for attendees, so Sawada Sensei here is from Tokyo University, and also he was our former ADB chief economist. Thank you, Sawada Sensei, and thank you, Professor Pande. Now, I'd like to invite back Dean Sonobe to close the session.
Okay, thank you very much. So once again, I'd like to thank Professor Pande for great presentation. So we learned that poverty is still remaining on the large scale, and also the problem of not only poverty but inequality is huge. And then the international cooperation is very important, vitally important, but also design of international cooperation is equally important. So she presented increasing evidence that technocratic innovation is far from enough, and then institution power, those things must be considered, and then multilateral organization like ADBI can work on, for example, strengthening the metrics and others. But ADBI will host T7 next year as part of Japan's G7 2023 presidency. So I'd like to make T7, Think 7 kind of venue for the discussion and the venue for bringing the voices of the think tanks and the university researchers in the global south to the G7 leaders. So I'd like to request Professor Pande to help us for organizing that kind of great big kind of events, or series of events, then to work together on improving the international cooperation. Thank you very much.
We'll be very happy to do that. I think that's a great, interest of us at the Growth Center as well. So we'll be very happy to collaborate on that.
Thank you very much. So with this, I'd like to close today's featured speaker webinar by Professor Pande. Thank you very much again. And everybody have a good day. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.